Hello and welcome to Let's Get Historical. I'm Jackie, and in this episode, we're going to be learning about Christine de Pizan. Let's go ahead and dive in. For those of you watching on YouTube, you're going to be seeing illustrations from illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Many of these are illustrations that Christine de Pizan would have overseen herself as her works were being produced. So that is a little spoiler alert. Let's go ahead and learn who Christine was so that all of this kind of starts making sense. All right, so Christine de Pizan was one of the most influential writers and commentators of medieval France during the turn of the 15th century. She wrote on politics and society, and we would consider her a feminist of her day, as she wrote several works advocating for women of all classes. Sort of. So she wrote on inspiring women in her own time period in history and mythology. She was well connected and knew the French royal family personally and was commissioned by kings, queens, dukes, and other important personages throughout France and Europe to write for them. She is unequivocally the most influential woman writer of her day and is generally considered the first woman in European history to make her profession from writing. I've personally read 2 of her books and I highly recommend them, and I also look forward to reading more. There's going to be a bibliography and further reading in the show notes if you are listening, and I also do include a bibliography at the end of this presentation. So I do want to note that I wrote this particular intro for Christine, and the following intro is actually going to be a fun segment that we are starting called History According to AI. So I asked an AI chatbot to provide me a brief biography on Christine de Pizan, and this is what it turned out. This was actually pretty decent, pretty good. I have tried it out with a few others, and there are definitely a few places where I think AI is getting confused. So, but here we go for Christine de Pizan. So according to AI, Christine de Pizan was a French author and the first professional female writer of the European Middle Ages. She was a prolific writer, producing books ranging from philosophy and political theory to biographies, poems, and manuals of arms and chivalry. She was the champion of women's rights and education, writing books that advanced the cause of women and argued for their equal treatment before the law. She was also an advocate for peace, and her works often focused on the role of women in war and peace. De Pizan was the first woman to be recognized for her work, setting the stage for other female writers to follow. Her works have been widely studied and honored in the centuries since her death, and her legacy continues to inspire others to this day. So all of this is pretty accurate. So pretty impressed there. And before we go ahead and dive into the episode, I do want to remind you to like, subscribe, and support us on Patreon if you are so called, to support content for women by women. So thank you so much. And let's go ahead and get started learning more about Christine. So we are going to learn about her life, her family, her upbringing, and then, her life as a writer, her career, all of those sorts of things. So we're starting with her father. Her father's name was Tommaso de Buonvenuto de Pisano. Apologies, my Italian is a bit rusty. So he studied medicine and astrology at the University of Bologna in Italy, and he was invited to the courts of Hungary and France. He left for France in 1364, intending only to stay there for about a year. However, he and Charles V really got along very well, Charles V being the King of France at the time. And so Charles V felt that Tommaso had become indispensable to him. And so he actually convinced him to relocate his family to Paris, and the king paid for all of their travel expenses. So for those of you on YouTube, this illustration is actually from a medicinal book about the connections in the body to kind of astrology. So I'm really fascinated by a lot of these things. And so I'm actually going to create a separate episode about that sort of the influence of astrology in medicine in the Middle Ages. It's actually very similar to a lot of what we would understand as Eastern medicine today. So that is a story for another day, but that's basically what this illustration is about. So For Christine's mother was the daughter of Tommaso's mentor, another Tommaso de Mondini. We actually do not know her mother's first name, so Christine never recorded it. It was just never recorded. And so though her mother was the daughter of a scholar, her mother was uneducated and did not believe that women should be educated. However, Christine described her mother as tender, loving, and caring. It is very clear throughout Christine's writings that she was, she did feel very affectionately toward her mother. And we're going to be learning. She also, cared for her mother as after her father passed. So Christine's childhood. So when Christine was just a few years old, about 4 or 5, she journeyed from Venice to Paris when King Charles V brought their family over. So she and her mother set out across Europe at this time. This was long before planes, trains, all those things. She and her mother were brought over probably in a caravan of carriages, and so they were literally going cross continent that way. And Christine actually recalls, this is a direct quote, passing through strange countries, over high Alps, and across wild plains, through deep forests and rushing rivers. So I just think it's so cool, since Christine was a prolific writer. We actually have her descriptions of these events in her life, of the environments that she witnessed, and her travels. And so that is, I personally just think it's such an amazing window into the past. And so when they arrived in Paris, they were presented at court in December at the Louvre. Before the Louvre was a museum. It was actually a medieval castle. It was one of the royal castles. And Christine and her mother were presented to Charles V and his 3 brothers, who all became her future patrons. And so for those of you watching this picture, I actually took this myself. When you're at the Louvre, you can actually go see parts of the original medieval stone castle. And it's mostly just the walls that are intact, because the Louvre was actually built, the museum was built on top of the medieval castle. And if you want to learn more about that, Napoleon did that in the 1800s, pretty much just built this huge palace on top of the medieval castle. So you can still see it, and it's really cool. And these are stones that chances are Christine saw herself. They probably looked a bit different when she was seeing these back in the 1300s, but there they are. All right, so more about Christine's childhood. So she described her childhood as merry, happy, with lots of singing and laughter. She had 2 younger brothers, Paolo and Agnolfo. And not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But she also said she found it difficult to learn French. So remember, she was born in Italy. She had learned Italian as a child, and so she found it a bit difficult to learn French, but she did eventually succeed. And she was mainly educated informally through conversations with her father. However, her mother did teach her discretion, retention, science, and history in preparation for marriage. So those were the subjects that at this time it was believed that women needed to be knowledgeable about in order to attract a well-to-do an educated husband. So in order to do that, she was taught certain subjects. And the fact that her father was, a physician and astrologer at court, meant that he had a lot of knowledge that he passed on to her as well. All right. So speaking of Christine's marriage, so since her father was so well connected at court, and since he was such a close confidant and counselor of the king, there were actually suitors vying for the king's favor who would approach her father, wanting to, make that connection, kind of networking, right? A marriage of advantage. However, her father saw right through them. He saw the ones that were just after, favor or power, etc. However, there was one suitor who did pass her father's test. His name was Etienne du Castel. He was a scholar at court from a noble family, and he had known her father since his arrival in Paris. So this is someone who had a personal relationship with her father, and so her father trusted him. So they had an arranged marriage. So they were married in 1379. Christine was 15, and I do believe that Etienne was about 10 to 15 years older than her, which at the time, would not have been too big of an age difference. It was actually probably a pretty good match, and it did turn out to be a very good match. So Etienne promised to be loyal to Christine, and according to Christine, their marriage was loving and they trusted one another completely. And her descriptions of their married life and their relationship are incredibly heartfelt and authentic. And it just really gives you a sense of, how they felt about each other and how they interacted with each other. And so for me, it was really cool to, read just about how relationships, in the past developed and all that stuff, and how similar it is to today, right? Like, we're all human beings here. So, yeah. All right. So Christine as a wife and mother. So Etienne and Christine, when they started their family life, they had 3 manservants and 4 maids. And so this was definitely an indicator of their status, right? Her husband was a scholar at court. He worked for the king. And so therefore they were doing pretty well. Their eldest child, a daughter, was born in 1381. Their first son, who was born, I think, a year or two after, died young. But their second son, Jean, who was born in 1385, and he did survive. And the couple was incredibly happy. Years later, Christine wrote that marriage was the ideal state between men and women, as long as men treat their wives as perfect companions. So this is something that we see throughout Christine's writings, is really her understanding of, relationships, and how she encourages others to sort of show up in their relationships, because she does have a lot of writings about relations between men and women, especially married men and women. And so that is essentially what her long stated philosophy is. She was definitely an advocate for fair treatment, for partnership in marriage, things like that we would understand today. All right, so tragedy and hardship. So in 1380, Charles V died, and Tommaso, Christine's father, was left in a precarious role at court with reduced and irregular pay. So Charles V, saw Christine's father as an indispensable counselor, right? And he was very, very interested in astrology and all of those things. And that was sort of falling out of fashion after Charles V died. So it was something where, when you're living in a time where a lot of the court, a lot of the politics is centered around the king. If the king has a certain interest and he employs people who are experts in that field, and then the king dies, and then that interest is not shared by his successor, then you don't need those court employees anymore. And so that's kind of what happened to Christine's father. So he was no longer paid at the same rate he was used to, and he was often, told that he wasn't really needed at court. And fortunately for some, unfortunately for Christine's family, her father had given all his extra money to the poor. So even though he had been making really good money throughout his career, his time at court, being such a close counselor to the king, he was a very altruistic person. He gave a lot of his money to the poor in Paris and other areas in France. And so even though that is an amazing, wonderful, wonderful thing to do, unfortunately, he did not have any savings to support his family should his circumstances change. And so when his circumstances did change, they did fall on hard times. So her father fell ill shortly after the king died, and Christine cared for him until his death. And so during this time, Luckily for the family, Etienne was favored by the court of Charles VI, who was underage, so he had a regency, and throughout the 1380s. So he was able to support his family, but that does not mean that they were not living in the same at the same standard, I should say, that they had been used to previously. All right. So, grief and widowhood. So, in 1389, Etienne accompanied the king to Beauvoir, where he fell ill and died suddenly at the age of just 34. There was no doctor on site, and so there was no one to diagnose kind of what he fell ill with or anything like that. Contrary to popular opinion, doctors at this time were actually pretty knowledgeable about diseases. They would have been able to tell you, what disease he had, but unfortunately there was no doctor with the company, and so we do not know what happened. So Christine was given this news. She was only 25 at the time. She was absolutely devastated, and she stated later on in her works that all her good days were at an end. That is a direct quote. This is also a direct quote. She said, quote, I was so confused with grief that I became a recluse, dull, sad, alone, and weary, end quote. The reason I put this in this episode is because I really wanted to highlight how grief is the same throughout the ages. In a lot of my conversations with, just friends and people in general, when I talk about history, sometimes, we have this tendency to think that, because death was more common in the past, that people didn't feel grief the way that we do. But that's just simply not true. People grieved exactly, they felt the same things. We would not have evolved to experience grief the way that we do if our ancestors did not experience grief in that way. So I just think that perfectly encapsulates a lot of feelings of grief that most people can relate to if they have lost someone, one of the closest people to them in their lives. Moving on, practicality saved her. That is what Christine said. She needed to support her mother, her brothers, and her children, and she was the only one really of working age in order to do that at this time. Her brothers were still, I believe they were probably teenagers at this time, so they could probably do some things, but she was really the breadwinner, and she also needed to support her young children who were, just like, around like 5 to 8, I believe. So, yeah. All right. So life going on. So Christine, to settle her husband's modest estate, it took 14 years. Even with her connections at court, bureaucratic red tape got in the way pretty much every single step of the way. This was also something that I found very similar to our modern age. My father is an estate planning attorney, and so I've heard all the horror stories of just how long it takes to settle estates sometimes. And unfortunately, Christine experienced that, even with her connections at court. There's an anecdote that she shared where someone at court actually wrote a letter to the bureaucratic representative in order to try to help her, and the bureaucrats essentially just like tossed it away, like threw it back in her face, and were like, no, we don't care what the king's advisor says, or whatever it is. So those sorts of things are not new. Some things never change. But throughout this time, Christine had to convince her lawyers to help her. Remember, she was a widow, and alone, didn't really have a close adult male family member to help her out. She was frequently accused of having affairs with her lawyers. She shares several stories about her lawyers being rude to her in the streets and things like that. And it was very interesting, because some of the anecdotes that she shared were, I feel like, sometimes women get treated like that still, when it's just, when you're a lone woman and you're out there, and there are still some people who will try to take advantage of women. And so I think that a lot of this that she was going through is still incredibly relatable today. What little she did receive from her husband's estate didn't really last that long, and she was really just consumed with grief and kind of the struggle of trying to settle the estate, that she began to write ballads to cope with her grief. And she eventually moved on to love ballads. This also is so I also find so interesting. I know several people who have done like grief writing or trauma writing as kind of a form of therapy. And so it's really interesting to see that, Christine was doing this back in the late 1300s, even before, the fields of psychology and that sort of understanding was as structured as it is today. All right. So, rebuilding her family's life. So, Christine had to sell Memoron, which was a castle that her father had purchased, along with his other French properties. So, he had accumulated some properties during his time as a counselor to the king. And then in 1394, her brothers moved back to Italy to sort of make their own way in the world. So that helped Christine because she didn't have to support them anymore. They were on their own. And then in 1397, her son Jean accompanied the Earl of Salisbury back to England for his education. So during this time, this was in the middle of the Hundred Years' War between England and France. And so there were a lot of English noblemen in France at this time, and the Earl of Salisbury was one of them. And he brought her son Jean back with him to England. It was very common at this time for young, well-connected boys / young men, teens, essentially, to go into the house of a nobleman for training and education. And so that is something that her son would have done. It would have been considered an honor that he was chosen by, a high-ranking English nobleman to be in his household. So during this time, Christine began educating herself through books. So she really read a lot, and it kind of set the foundation for her career, which started in just a few years. So in 1399, Salisbury was beheaded. So he was the one who had taken her son back to England with him. And so Christine essentially, she wanted her son to come back to France to, be with her, be closer to home, etc. And at this time, even though she had not written any of her formative works yet, she had written a lot of these ballads and they were, being shared. And so people knew that she was a talented writer. Henry IV of England actually wanted Christine to come to England and be one of his court poets, essentially, court writers. Yeah. All that stuff. And so Christine did not really want to, but she didn't want to flat out say no because he was the king. So she essentially said, I want my son back first, and then I'll decide. And then once her son came back, she declined the king's offer and stayed in France. All right. So now we're into Christine becoming a writer. So in the year 1400, Christine published her first full-length work, which was called Othea. The Dukes of Orleans, Burgundy, and Berry commissioned their own copies. Christine oversaw the creation and illumination of her manuscripts, which eventually became too time-consuming. So prior to the printing press, which was actually in the European Latin version of the printing press was invented just after Christine's death, actually. So during her lifetime, manuscripts were done by hand. So if you wanted a book, you would quite literally have to commission it. Someone would have to pay for it. And there would be scribes writing the text, and then there would be artists illuminating the manuscripts and having the illustrations, much like you've seen throughout this entire presentation. So to use this particular example for those of you watching on YouTube, as you can tell, this text is actually, it's handwritten. So all of that's handwritten. The illustration is hand drawn as well. And all of these would have been done in kind of a factory isn't the right term, but it's sort of like a factory. I'm totally blanking on like what it was, but it sort of is kind of like, if you imagine it, you're kind of in in a workshop. That's the word I'm looking for. So it would have been done in a workshop. So you would have had scribes, writing down the text, and then you would have had artists doing the illuminations, and Christine would have been overseeing all of them. However, since demand for her works were so great, eventually that became too time consuming for her, and so she had to focus on writing, and she had to let her her scribes and illustrators do the rest. So also around this time, Christine's daughter was chosen as an official companion to Princess Marie of France, and becoming a nun at Poissy Abbey. So it was pretty common during the Middle Ages for royal families to kind of sacrifice one of their children or multiple to the church. I don't want to say sacrifice to the church, but give them to the church as kind of like an offering, for God, right? Like dedicating their lives to God. And so a number of young royal children were taken to abbeys. Boys and girls were, but in this case, Princess Marie was a small child when her parents decided that she would be offered as an offering to God, bringing her to Poissy Abbey. And, as the princess, she needed official companions to join her. And so Christine's daughter was chosen as one of them. That would have been considered a very high status honor that was bestowed upon Christine's daughter. So even though she's essentially, her life is sort of being decided for her. It's being decided that she's going to become a nun in order to join the princess. It was seen as a very honorable and thing for her to do, a very pious thing for her to do. Putting her faith in God and things like that. Putting her life in God's hands, all those things. So even though she was at Poissy Abbey, Christine visited often. This abbey was just outside of Paris, so it was very easy for Christine to visit her daughter. All right, now Christine's rising star. So this is kind of the point in her career where she becomes a voice for women. So in 1401, Christine wrote a debate on Romance of the Rose, which is a popular allegorical poem of the time that depicted women in a very negative light. So this is something she wrote her response to this poem, and it was shared publicly. And the king's secretary criticized her. He claimed that her views were not valid because she was a, quote, passionate woman. However, Christine stuck up for herself, and the king's secretary quickly backed down. The secretary's brother then tried to defend him, started sending her hate mail. All of these things that I feel like today now kind of play out on social media. This was sort of playing out in a slower time frame in Christine's life, right? There were these public letters that were going out. He said, she said, those sorts of things. But Christine was sticking up for herself the whole time. She did not back down, even when, multiple men were, going against her. So before I dive into the formative works of Christine's career, where she talks a lot about women's rights as well as a lot of other subjects, I want to talk a little bit about women in the 14th and 15th centuries in France. So one of the things that comes up frequently when we talk about the Middle Ages is chivalry. What is it? Is chivalry dead? When did it die? All of those things. But at this time, people at least believed that chivalry was still alive, and so at this time there were two chivalric orders that were established to uphold women's interests. So the first one was to uphold the property rights of noble women when other men claimed their lands. So this is something that was this order was established essentially to protect the property rights of noble women from perhaps their husbands' male relatives coming to try to claim the land, usually with soldiers and other things like that. And so this is definitely definitely helpful, a good support for women, showing men in noblemen in France being allies even when their peers are trying to, possess the the property of noblemen. And then number two, the second chivalric order at this time was more relaxed, more informal, I should say, order. It was called the Court of Love. It was located in Burgundy, and its purpose was to provide guidance on women's love lives. So whether they were noble women or kind of landed gentry, middle class women, women would come and essentially share. Ask advice, right? So it was kind of a combination. It was sort of like a reality show. Like that's like the best modern day equivalent I can think of. Like it was sort of like this reality show where women can actually get advice and men can actually help them, right? So it's really funny to kind of read about it and learn about it. But let's continue and talk about Christine. So now we're going to talk about royal patronage. This is really where Christine's career takes off. So in 1403, the Duke of Burgundy accepts Christine's son Jean, who had previously been in England, into his household. So after a few years, he now is able to get his education back on track. He's able to learn all the things that he would need to as a kind of a member of noble circles, I should say. So on New Year's 1404, Christine sent Burgundy her latest work, the Book of Fortune, which is about the history of the world. And this work highlighted the many contributions of many women. This was essentially a work that the Duke commissioned for Christine, and she included women as well, which also shows that the Duke of Burgundy would have been open to learning about women in this history of the world that he commissioned. And he was so impressed, actually, with this book that he commissioned her to write an official biography of his brother, King Charles V. So, Christine as the king's biographer. So this was an incredible honor. Christine's biography is actually one of the only extant biographies, contemporary biographies of a French king in the Middle Ages by someone who actually knew him. And so the title of her biography is Le Livre de Faits et Bon Mœurs du Roi Charles V. And my French is also not great. But that essentially translates roughly to the book of good deeds and morals of the wise King Charles V. And so Christine understood that this work would live on in posterity. She knew that it would be one of her most important works. It's the only source for some information on Charles's life and reign. It also includes his schedule, his life as a monarch, husband, and father. So it's incredibly comprehensive. And it's also one of the main insights that we have into what a royal court was like during the Middle Ages, and it was all written by Christine. She also claimed that Charles V wanted to pass on the crown when his son reached a majority so that he could become a priest. So the king's piety was something that she talked a lot about in his biography. Also, one thing that to note that I personally appreciated as a Jewish woman is that Charles treated Jews as any other subjects. And so, during the Middle Ages, Jews were treated as second-class citizens at best. And that's also, the term citizen didn't really have a meaning, or it had meaning, but it was really only used to reference citizenship during the Roman Empire. So it did not mean what we think it means today. Let's just say that. The king had subjects. He did not necessarily have citizens. And so, but the Jews being a minority in Europe, since they were not Christian, they were separated from the rest of society, and had completely separate rules a lot of times that they had to live by. However, Charles V, according to Christine de Pizan, treated his Jewish subjects as any other subjects. So that is just a nice little insight. All right, so now we're going to talk about a work of self-reflection that Christine actually wrote. It's very indicative of some of the styles during the Middle Ages. So it's called La Vision Christine. It was written in 1405, and it's an allegorical work where Christine relates her autobiography through visions shown to her. So this was very common during the Middle Ages to sort of have allegorical works, works that were supposed to teach, morals and lessons, sort of like a self-help book, like a medieval self-help book, but through visions that were shown to you. So instead of saying, I learned this, this is how I learned it, etc., you would essentially say, a vision, sent by God showed me. And so it was a literary device essentially. But during or in this work, Christine lamented the great losses that she suffered and her emotional and financial struggles. So she's really getting personal here. And she states that the spirits in her vision showed her that she needed to learn from her misfortune in order to fulfill God's plan for her. So you can kind of see why I'm categorizing it as like a self-help book from the Middle Ages, using literary devices that were very common at the time. And so basically all of this culminates in La Vision Christine to say that at 42, Christine decided that she was going to stop pitying herself and change her outlook on life. And so that is essentially what she is what she is encouraging others to do as well through this work. The fact that she, published this work, this was not like a diary, right? Like she wrote this specifically wanting to help others learn how to manage their own, emotional and financial struggles and other struggles that they go through in their lives. And so I think this just also kind of shows, Christine's, the fact that when Christine was writing, she had like a deeper purpose to her writings. It was not just all about, what were royalty commissioning her to write. She did also write works for society, which we'll see more of in just a second. So Christine, as a political commentator, so one of the political books that she wrote was the Livre du Cours de Policy, which is basically the book on policy. And so it was the first political commentary on ideal body politic and how France should incorporate its principles. So she did not believe in government by the people because at this time, the people were uneducated. There was no public education system. It was not considered, it was by no means common at all for regular people anywhere in the world to be educated. This was just simply, the way that the world was in the Middle Ages. And so she also, however, did not believe that noble family, regional states like controlled by noble families, like in her native Italy, she did not believe that those were good either. There was, a lot of infighting in Italy at this time. There was really what we understand as kind of like a united Italy was sort of not, it was conceptual at the time, but it wasn't a reality. And so she sort of created her own political philosophy that she believed that France should follow. So Christine broke up society into three groups. The first being the clergy and students. Also, fun fact, at this time, most university students were going to be members of the clergy. There were very few professions that needed higher education, and most universities were essentially theology schools, and then they had, a few other subjects that people could learn as well. The second group were merchants and burgesses, and then the third group were artisans and laborers. Christine had a relatively negative perspective on artisans and laborers, so this was before before the times when people are kind of talking about equality of all the classes and things like that. So they were definitely three different groups in society that Christine recognized, and she believed that there was kind of a different way of governing, that's the right word, governing each of them. Okay, so Christine as a medieval feminist icon. So the Book of the City of Ladies is one of Christine's most well-known works. So Christine essentially built a metaphorical city of ladies in response to writers who maligned women. So this was a very mission-driven work. This was not necessarily something that was originally commissioned for her to write. She took it upon herself to write this book. And so in the book, Christine asserts that men secretly realize that women are superior, but they don't wish to acknowledge it. She provides many examples from real life and mythology of women's accomplishments and inventions. And she notes that some male writers like Boccaccio and Ovid praise women. So she essentially, is recognizing the allies that are out there. And I've personally read the book of the City of Ladies. I think that it's wonderful if you are interested at all in medieval Europe or learning kind of how, learning various, kind of feminist histories, I suppose you could say, the evolution of feminism throughout the ages, then I would highly recommend reading the Book of the City of Ladies. It's what I love about it is that like so much of it is still relatable today. There are things that are just distinctly human, and they really shine through the centuries. Okay, so now we're going to learn a little bit about the women that Christine wrote about in the Book of the City of Ladies. So the Book of the City of Ladies is geared toward noble women. We're going to talk in just a second about the book that Christine wrote for kind of all women throughout society. But for noble women in particular, she mentions Novella of Bologna, who teaches in place of her father at university. So she's an educated woman in Italy. She also mentions Anastase, who is the best and highest paid illuminator in all of Paris. And so this is someone that Christine would have known personally. She was probably illustrating some of Christine's Christine's works as well. She also mentions Isabeau of Bavaria, who's the Queen of France during much of Christine's lifetime. She also talks about Valentina of Orleans, Jane of Berry, and Mary of Berry and Bourbon. So these were essentially the main duchesses that were in France at the time, and essentially, holding power, alongside their husbands, but also after their husbands died as well. And so she kind of talks about the contributions that these women have made to society, and she also discusses what she brings them forth as examples, but she also discusses their accomplishments. And then she also does address wives of burgesses and men of all estates as well in the Book of the City of Ladies, essentially making sure that she is addressing kind of all the people of the upper classes, essentially. So now we'll move on to the Treasure of the City of Ladies, which is geared toward women of all other classes. So, especially since society at the time, noble women would have been highly educated. They would have been used to, kind of a certain type of communication. So Christine communicated and also included, several examples that, more educated women would understand and would have heard of, would have learned about. Whereas, women in the other classes may not have the same levels of education. Many of them may not be literate. And so essentially she wanted to ensure that she was providing, her two different audiences with material that would be relatable to them. So there are many relatable passages in the Treasure of the City of Ladies that also do ring true today. And so also recommend that you all read that one. I read both Book of the City of Ladies and Treasure of the City of Ladies, and I liked both of them. And so Christine's evolution, just in terms of how she views kind of women in society and their relations to men. So she starts by saying, that men supporting women would be enough. However, through her, her life, she essentially comes to believe that women can also have their own independent space, not in opposition to men, but equal to them. And that is essentially the foundation for her, quote unquote, City of Ladies, right? This metaphorical city that she is building. That's why, that's why she calls it a City of Ladies. So yeah, I hope that sort of metaphor is clear. But throughout it all, Christine always advocated for supportive marriages. She talks a lot about marriage in both the Book of the City of Ladies as well as the Treasure of the City of Ladies. So that's also really interesting to read about as well. Okay, so this illustration, as I mentioned before, actually adorns one of the copies of the book that Queen Isabeau commissioned Christine for. This is actually an illustration of Christine presenting the book itself to Queen Isabeau. So the woman in the center on the ground in blue, holding the red book, is Christine. And this was an illustration done like in her lifetime, like shortly after she wrote the book. So Christine personally oversaw the creation of this manuscript, kind of as I just alluded to, and there were also many sightings of Christine that are noted by contemporaries writing of their time in Paris. And so this really shows that she had become a local celebrity. So there were people writing home to their families, whether they were from other parts of France or from other countries even, and essentially saying that they saw Christine de Pizan right in the streets, or they spoke to her or something like that. So she was a very well-known person. Many times she was the only woman that people would write home about. So she was essentially one of the most influential women, not just in France, but also outside of France, because people had heard of her outside of France. And we're actually going to talk about that in just a second as well. First, we're going to talk about Christine's main book on warfare. So, how many women, did you believe in the Middle Ages were writing about warfare? But essentially, the book that Christine wrote was the Livre de Faits d'Armes et de Chivalry. So it was basically the book of arms and chivalry. And we're going to kind of talk about how did Christine come to write this work? So in 1407, Louis of Orleans was murdered. He was one of the siblings of the king, and his murder was actually ordered by John of Burgundy, who, if I'm getting my history correct, was his uncle, I believe. They were related. And so this essentially threw France into a civil war. So Christine at this time wrote of the proper way to lead an army if you were not the king. She wrote about the qualities of good soldiers, choosing campsites and battle preparation. She wrote about supplies for food and weapons, assault machines, laws governing military and civilians in times of war, and heraldry as well, which was really important. That's like family crests and stuff like that. Those were used a lot on the battlefield to identify different groups, who was fighting with who, etc. So more on the Book of Arms and Chivalry. Christine asserts that a woman is qualified to write a book on war because the men waging war do not have writing skills. So I personally found this to be a very humorous note on hers, kind of humor that, rings true through the ages. And this also became one of the most praised works on arms and warfare from the Middle Ages in Europe. It was written and then later printed in many different languages. And so of the 20 manuscripts that exist from the Middle Ages, so these are manuscripts, this is before it was done in print, only 9 list her as the author. So essentially what that shows us is that 45% of medieval society in different countries, because as I said, these manuscripts are written in different languages, 45% were perfectly fine with having a woman write a book on war. It was only 55% where they hid that, right? They did not put her name on it because they thought that might affect, people purchasing and reading the book. So that is just something that I wanted to highlight too, because I think, we often have this misconception that, things for women were just absolutely, horrendous, and, women were just like, ignored or oppressed throughout all of society. And in actuality, 45% of Europeans were perfectly fine reading a book on warfare written by a woman. So there's that. Okay, so unfortunately, things with the Civil War continued to escalate. So in August 1410, Christine wrote a plea to the nobles of France to avoid civil war. She specifically named Queen Isabeau's contributions to the current turmoil. So she was essentially kind of I want to say calling the queen forward, but she was essentially highlighting some of the things that Queen Isabeau did to ferment turmoil in the country. And in September 1410 to 1412, this is where the Civil War, much of the Civil War fighting actually occurred. And there were truces in winter because, yeah, it's, snow. Nobody likes fighting in snow. And around this time, Christine also wrote Livre de la Paix, which is the Book of Peace. So Christine praises the Dauphin for proposing peace. So the Dauphin is the crown prince in France, and at around 1412, he did propose peace. Christine references times when the Dauphin was not as inclined to peace. So she is being very honest and real with the prince, and she's not just overly praising him, right? Which also shows that she was respected so much by the royal family, society as a whole, that she felt comfortable not just praising but also criticizing the crown prince. And she also mentions meeting with him in person. So she did also have meetings with the Prince of France as well, who at this time was leading the French army for the royalist side. So should we say. Now, in 1415 is when one of the most important battles during the 100 Years' War between England and France took place. So this was a decisive English victory over the French. Many nobles who had commissioned Christine's works, many French nobles who commissioned Christine's works over the years, were killed or taken prisoner at Agincourt. Shortly thereafter, the Dauphin Louis and John, the Duke of Burgundy, died. They were two big patrons of Christine. And then Charles, the King Charles VI, youngest son, Charles, then became the Dauphin at the age of 12. In 1416, the Duke of Berry died. He was the last royal patron from the days of Charles V, so he was really one of the last main patrons of Christine, which is why it's most likely that Christine left Paris in 1418 before the city was invaded by the Duke of Burgundy in May. Okay, so Christine in retirement. So Christine retired to an abbey, most likely Poissy, where her daughter is still believed to have been in residence. Also, kind of fun fact, during the Middle Ages, abbeys often served as medieval retirement homes. So the church really took the place of much of our, what we would understand today to be healthcare system. So essentially, the church had hospitals and infirmaries, for people who were ill. And then many times, regular members of society would also go to abbeys if they didn't have, family members to care for them in their old age. They could go to abbeys or other church properties like monasteries and things like that, and be lay people kind of as their retirement, and they would be cared for by either the monks or nuns or priests who were there. So during her time at this abbey in 1418 to 1419, Christine wrote a religious work on consoling women in times of grief, and she relied heavily on scripture. So this is a much more religious work than a lot of her other works have been. And that, may also reflect just the fact that she was in a religious institution. And so it was much more present in her life than it had been previously. And then in July 1429, Christine wrote a poem commemorating the military victories of Joan of Arc. And Christine's poem is the most contemporary account of Joan's triumphs. And, some people who have tried to assert over the years that Joan of Arc didn't really do the things she did, or she's reported to do, right? They were exaggerated, etc. Christine's poem actually is one of the only pieces of evidence that we have from the contemporary period that includes stories of what exactly Joan of Arc was doing. And so that proves that, shortly after the victories that Joan of Arc experienced, this is what people were essentially talking about, right? Like in the streets of Paris, this is what was the news that was being brought to them. And so this really highlights, and makes it very difficult for Joan of Arc's detractors to say that, she really didn't do these things, because we actually have contemporary evidence that she did. And it is believed that Christine died soon after writing this poem, so approximately 1430, because no further writings survive. And as such a prolific writer, she probably would have continued writing something if she was well enough to, in the following years. So, that essentially concludes our presentation on Christine de Pizan. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, like, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. I do want to mention one thing before I switch us to the bibliography page. For those of you watching on YouTube, this particular illustration and some of the other illustrations that were a little more gray, for lack of a better word, shall we say, is actually from a copy of Christine de Pizan's works that was commissioned by one of the other women that we are going to be learning about later in this season, Margaret of York. So I just wanted to do that little teaser, because these illustrations were commissioned by her, and we're also going to see, for some, not all, but for some of these women that I'm going to be highlighting during the 15th century, many of them either knew each other or knew of each other, and all looked to each other as role models. So just women supporting women in the Middle Ages is what we're going to be talking about here. And now I will allow you to see the bibliography. For those of you on YouTube, for those of you listening to the podcast, you'll have this bibliography in the show notes. But this is where you can, look for various works from Christine de Pizan. I highlighted some of the ones that were mentioned in this presentation. And I also included the Order of the Rose, which is a biography that a writer, historian, and biographer wrote on Christine, I believe in the late 20th century. So, well, thank you, and I'll catch you in the next episode.